On such a rotten weather night. I'm Jim McWilliams in the Department of Language and Literature. When I came 13 years ago, Dave and Carl and Ray were all senior, and they'd been there forever, and it seemed like they would be there forever. So it's a little surprising to me to all of a sudden the last couple of years, or last year, I've been the senior department member, which is very odd. But anyway, I thought I'd say a few words about Ray Wheeler. When I asked the VPAA's office for the most recent curriculum vitae for Ray Wheeler, I received a document that lists Ray as being in his 20th year of service at DSU. This document, therefore, must be from 1985. And here it is. As most of you know, Ray became sick in fall 2009 and then officially retired in May 2010. If you're quicker at math than I am, you've already done the subtraction and realized that Ray Wheeler taught at DSU for 44 years. Ray and Carl Larson had a long-standing dispute about which of them was the most senior faculty member at DSU. If I remember correctly, this dispute turned on the fact that Carl, who started at DSU in 1963, left for a year to complete his doctorate. So consequently, Carl had one more year of total years service. But Ray, who started at DSU in 1965, had more consecutive years of service, which to him was the most important fact. However, since Ray most certainly did not want to carry the mace at commencement, he was happy to cede ground and let Carl be the senior professor at DSU, which made Carl very happy. Of course, all of this became moot when Carl retired, so soon enough, Ray was senior both in total years of service and in consecutive years of service. Ray wasn't happy to carry the mace, but he did it faithfully until he retired. By the way, I assume, or perhaps hope, that 44 years of service teaching at DSU is the record. I do not intend to try for that record. On his vita, Ray lists his many presentations, lectures, and performances for the North Dakota Humanities Council and other state and regional entities. Ray had a reputation as an important Midwest playwright in the 1970s and 1980s, and he also published poems and the occasional short story in both regional and national journals. He also edited a literary magazine, the Dickinson Review, which I actually became a little bit familiar with before I moved here when I was compiling a bibliography of interviews with American authors and requested the Dickinson Review through interlibrary loan. So I actually knew a little bit, at least about the Dickinson Review and the interviews that Ray conducted for that magazine before I came here. On this vita, Ray lists the various offices and positions he held at DSU through the years, including the things you would expect, like Professor of English and Chair of the Department of Language and Literature. He also lists some of the duties that he performed at DSU. And I'm not making any of these up. Ray says that he was at DSU, he was a social worker, a laboratory technician, and general factotum. Also on this vita, Ray states that he is the international president of the Lunar Society. While I'm not sure what that means, I suspect it's a reference to a number of mooning incidents that allegedly occurred here on campus in the late 1960s. I could never pin him down on the details, and if you know Ray, he never tells the story the same way twice, so I could never pin him down, but I strongly suspect that Ray might have been involved in those mooning incidents many years ago. I'm surprised, however, that Ray didn't list on his vita that he was president of the Dickinson Poets Club. The Poets Club met every Thursday evening during the academic year down at the Rock. Admission to the club was easy. You just had to be able to drink some beer and tell some lies. Fortunately, I could do both. I miss those Thursdays at the Rock with Ray, just as I miss him being in the office next door to mine. For my first 9 years at DSU, I could count on Ray stopping by every morning, along about 7, to gossip and, as he put it, shoot the shit. Most of what I learned about DSU I learned from Ray, either at the Rock at 7 or at 7 in the morning in Stickney Hall. So the next time you're having a beer or you're shooting the shit, stop for a minute to remember Ray Wheeler and his many contributions to Dickinson State University. Thank you.
I am Margaret Barnhart. I do not have seniority in the Department of Language and Literature, but I make up for that with longevity. I don't know how that happened. I am here to introduce Dr. Solheim, who I met way back in the last century, when we were both working, even in millennials. We were both working on a radio vignette. Do you remember that?
Yes.
For the North Dakota Humanities Council, which aired later on public radio. And I guess I felt so enlightened by that experience that I decided to return to school and become further enlightened by Dr. Solheim, Dr. Larson, and Dr. Wheeler. So I am one who has benefited from their teaching as well as benefited from working with them in various degrees. Dave has his degrees, of course, you can read all about this on the flyers, but his degrees in creative writing, poetry, American literature from Stanford University and from Denver. Taught English here at DSU since 1983 until his recent retirement. For 12 of those years, of course, he was department chair. He's been involved in many aspects at DSU. Already mentioned is his creating this Heart River Writer Circle, or co-creating it. He's also been instrumental in Communiversity, in the Albers Festival. He's worked with the ethnic organizations in the community. I could go on and on and on. He's also been instrumental in heading a writing project at the Killdeer Retirement Home, the Hilltop Home of Comfort. And I did have the distinct pleasure to work with him with that. He graciously allowed me to accompany him and help record the voices of the seniors in that Hilltop Home. And that was, of course, published. So it is there for the posterity of those residents. Dave has many publications, several chapbooks of poetry. His poems have appeared in a number of scholastic journals and have been included in several regional or state anthologies. And again, if I go through the list, I'm going to take up all his reading time, so I don't want to do that. I do want to tell you how far his influence has gone. Again, in the last millennium, way back in 19... Dave taught a creative writing class. And the class loved it so much that they did not want to see the semester end. The semester did end, but the class decided to keep meeting. And so once a month, the writers would get together, calling themselves Writers Exchange. And we are still going, although we do miss our guru. I say that's a great deal of influence. I am really honored and pleased to introduce Professor Emeritus, teacher, advisor, mentor, colleague, and friend, Dave Solheim.
Well, thank you all very much. It's good to see you all here. With introductions like that, I feel like I should be coming in a casket, perhaps. But I'll try to carry on as if I were still alive. And read a few things to you. I'm going to do a kind of sampler, a few poems from each book, and then a few more recent writings that haven't been published yet. So I'll be especially happy to get feedback on those in case I need to make some changes before I share them with a larger audience, or attempt to. I'd like to begin with a poem I wrote a number of years ago and I'd kind of forgotten about until I started doing some talks about poetry, and I decided, yeah, this is a pretty good thesis. So, this poem is called Containers. I'd like to write poems like $2 pots, sell them at summer sales, and make people happy because my poems hold water. So that's one theme that will be going on tonight in the readings. If you listen carefully, you'll hear a number of poems that touch on teaching and learning experiences. What else could I talk about? And you may also hear a kind of series of self-images that are revised and corrected over time. Like the poem I first read, it's not adjusted for inflation. I think I'd have to say, what, $15 pots now these days, but it's an old poem, so I kept it in that time. The same thing with the dates and years in some of the things I'll read. If it says you know, 40 years ago, you might have to add 10 years to that, you know, and you can make the adjustments. So a few years ago, when I first started teaching here, I kept saying, oh, about 5 years ago we did this that way. And then I started thinking, well, that isn't quite right. And then I switched to 15 years ago, and I'm afraid that isn't enough anymore either. So I'll leave all those numbers and adjustments and corrections up to you. But let me read a few things from my first full-length book of poems. And again, you can listen for those two themes, a little bit about teaching and learning, a little bit about adjusted, revised self-image. And there'll be other things as well. That should show up. This one is called Underground Living. My students' eyes are wells in abandoned farmyards, faces wooden covers for the deepest shafts. If I break through and fall, there is no room to turn or slow my progress until I'm wedged between the walls or buried at the bottom where neglected waters pool. This one is called Halloween. We had a big witch scare here one year, 15 years ago. And I picked out some of the details of that from local experience and mixed in with my writing or my teaching of particularly young Goodman Brown. You might know that story by Hawthorne. This is called Halloween. Each year I teach Hawthorne's story, young Goodman Brown, who is so twisted by one night in the forest, he believes all Puritans are body snatchers, though feigning to be like him, elect. That night, in the lurid glow of a 20-foot neon cross, 3 men in camouflage suits hide among tombstones, hoping to discover a black mass. The county sheriff and parish priest circle the lake, followed by carloads of citizens seeking the devilish rites. They find the remains of hunting camps, children's hideouts, and a hobo jungle. The priest announces in the morning paper, real Satanists are too clever to leave any clues. I greet a student with my wish for rain. He says it's unlikely. All the signs, woolly bears and hog spleens, call for a dry winter. Like Brown, I wonder when my dream began and in which century it will end. This poem is called Plowing. I'm reading it because it's one of the first ones I published in a national magazine. Let's see if there's anything else I need to say about that. No. Southern Review, I think it was. Yeah. Plowing. Those Indians are gone now, but once in a while I find a flaked stone point. Sometimes an earthen mound that still must hold clay-packed bones. The faint outline of a buffalo wallow disappears in the furrow. As I erase another moment, the land lies holding. This poem, like the last one, plays around with syllabic lines, so many syllables per line. It's one of the kinds of games that poets play with themselves when they write to kind of make it both more interesting and more difficult. And sometimes to decide what to leave in and what to throw out. So this poem is called Target. It's a kind of uncomfortable observation and recollection about one of my grandparents. The last one, I think, did something like 7 syllables per line. This alternates 3s and 5s, if you want to try to count them as I read it. See if anybody can keep up. Target. Grandpa told me about killing horses, the ones too old to work, too bum to sell. The young men would chew some snuff and rub a spot on a critter's head, back off a ways, and put a bullet in that smudge. Grandpa sits and chews his snooze. A drop of juice falls on his chin. His fingers wipe it almost away. He stiffly leans and spits into the coffee can while I recall his story. Again, you can do some mathematical adjustment. This is 30th birthday, and I'll give you a mathematical clue as well. At the crossing, headed west, engine number 1947. I watched the year of my birth pull a string of boxcars, of empty boxcars, over the hill. You can imagine what things are like for me now. This one is called Immigrants, and it sets up some other family poems that will show up later on. And I guess I've been feeling very Norwegian lately since last summer as a result of retirement. I took a cruise, Baltic cruise, and also spent about 10 days in Norway meeting some brand new relatives. They were very generous to me, and it's made me think about my heritage a little bit more. So this is it's an old poem, but for me it has that reflection of recent discoveries. Immigrants. When the century rolled over, and that was not this last century, but the one before. Time is such a theme here, right? When the century rolled over, my grandfather, nearing manhood, left Norway, the mountain plots too small to feed all 5 brothers. His mother begged his promise not to write of grand America or your wonderful success. I will not lose all my children to your dreams across the ocean. In Advent, we await our own dream children to leave their parents beyond another sea to promise again. When grandfather visited his ancient home, memory led him to the sloping meadows of his childhood and the nearly forgotten house where his long-dead mother left a final gift. A rose-malt trunk dating from her wedding, a candle holder, embroidered apron, hard-ungered bridal sheets, and his mother's wish to wrap her absent child's life within. We await our children's coming to wrap them in the arms of now. And shortly about the time that poem was written, my first wife and I adopted some children. And this is something that my children taught me. It's called Old Man. Benjamin Sung Ho and Julia Ju Hyun, my soul-born children, tell me, in Korea a rabbit is in the moon. Tonight I watch the full face rising and notice how his eyes droop into the angles of elongated ears. Now I see everything twice, once with brown eyes, once with blue. And these next 2 poems are a couple of images from a previous form of my life. The title of this one is Drunk Again. It's in quotation marks, and it reads right into the poem itself. Drunk again, I say to the face in the mirror, looking him directly in the eyes, trying to see who is in there. I jab my face closer to his. Grabbing both metal-wrapped edges, I try to rip back his smooth skin to reveal who was walking around in my body, telling lies about me. This one's called The Overcoat. He couldn't remember when he began living in it. He used to wear it open, the long tails flapping behind him. As he felt the chill coming on, he started buttoning it. He wore it to work until the job ended, and monk-like to church on Sundays. Then he began sleeping in it, and couldn't remember the last woman who had even toyed with his buttons. Some nights he drank so much he disappeared, and only the coat went about his business. The coat had grafted to him, and if he undid it, his skin, body, and bones would fold out with the opened coat, and he would fail to expose himself. And as I approach the end of this second book, I'll read a poem called Approaching 50. That went from 30 to 50. It's moving right along here, right? Approaching 50. On a solitary walk to observe the night of my wintry birth, through the bare branches I see the fire of stars, cold comfort within the skull of sky. Where they seem to ornament a tree, I reach to grasp them and touch the hidden velvet buds, wrapped like chrysalises against the frost. They hold the leaf and flower of future apples. I imagine my death will be like this, a long walk into the dark, ended by pulling the world around me, blanketed by snow or leaves or grass, warming a dry seed, a chrysalis of light. This book the second book I'm reading from came out in 1999. It was just a couple of years after my first wife died and my father died. They were both in the hospital in serious condition at the same time. And that was a very stressful year, and I had very good colleagues to work with to help me through that time. I'll read a couple poems related to those events. The first one is called Conjunction, which means the coming together of two stars, among other things. It's also a form of part of speech and a few other things. We won't worry about all of those. Conjunction. In the advent of my father's dying, and the second moon since your passing, 4 planets arc across the southern sky. Saturn high in the southeast, and Jupiter due south, dim in the shining love of Venus. Hanging below the gibbous moon is the red smudge of Mars, the last ember of fireworks floating to the horizon. Patterned incomprehensibly, the memory of your life spreads out like stars beyond, where your wild goose spirit navigates toward home in the white haze of light, along the spirit path of the Milky Way. The light from 4 worlds, from the lunar edge, from the far universe, fall on this plot of dusty earth. The last poem in this book is called Long Distance, and again an image for loss and separation. As if in the aftermath of a great wind, among the toothpick splinters of a shattered home, survivors sift through scattered clothing, wind-blown papers and unread books, finger an earring, open a locket seeking the missing face, examine a shoe that fits no living foot, and imagine the disembodied voice coming over the phone of memory, even though the line is dead. Back in 1994, before some of these things happened, I was privileged to travel in China for about 3 weeks, courtesy of DSU and the university system. And it was a very fantastic experience, very, very moving and informative, and I learned a great deal about another culture, some good traveling companions. And about 15 years later, I finally was able to publish a book based on those. It included some translations, which I worked with a DSU student from China who helped me do those. I want to read just a few poems from this, the most recent of my books. Yeah, good, I still have about the right time. So a few poems about my experience visiting China for about 3 weeks in 1994. This one's called On the Way to China. It again has a time reference in it that probably is no longer accurate, but you'll just have to live with it. On the way to China, flying over the Aleutian Islands, I exchanged nods and simple greetings with the plane load of Japanese tourists returning home. As the Kodiak coastline emerges below a hole in the clouds, I wonder if they too recall that this is where our fathers tried to end our lives 50 years ago. This one is called Tiananmen. You might recall that famous square with some of the very famous place in China for years, but also a place of student revolt in about 1989, I think. Rushing through a Beijing evening in a chauffeured car, I see a schoolboy with close-cropped hair held by a traffic light halfway across the wide intersection near Tiananmen Square. He's thin as the painted line divider, fluttering his clothes as we pass. In his placid eyes I see that he too could stop a tank. And I had the chance to visit a lot of famous places in China that summer. And one that was the Shaolin Monastery. You might know that's the origin of the Kung Fu training and teaching. So this is a poem about my experience there. Shaolin Monastery. Where Kung Fu began, generations of monks have sanded the footprints of their discipline into the stone floors of temple rooms. Shaved and robed, a young monk sits at the foot of Buddha. At every donation, an